All right, this is our review for the first exam. We're going to talk about the first version of the argument from evil we discussed from J.L. Mackie. Remember that this argument is an argument against the existence of God from the existence of evil. And for us and for philosophers and theologians discussing the argument from evil, evil means simply any pain or suffering from whatever source. And so the source of the pain or suffering could be somebody doing something intentionally wrong or cruel. We could call that moral evil. It could be the result of some natural disaster. We could call that natural evil. But what matters is something counts as evil if it's just any instance of pain or suffering. And the argument from evil begins with a premise about the existence of evil and concludes that God does not exist. This is the short version of the argument from evil. The short version says, first, if God exists, then there's no evil. So if God exists, then there's no pain and suffering. But there is evil, therefore God does not exist. This is a valid argument, and its second premise here, the claim that there is evil, is certainly true. The way we've defined evil, if you have ever experienced pain or suffering of any sort, you should accept that second premise. So the real question is, why should we think that God's existence would rule out or be incompatible with the existence of evil? Why think that if God exists, then there's no evil at all? And when we turn to J.L. Mackie, he gives us an argument for that first premise, and the argument turns on claims or propositions that are part of classical theism itself. Here's what Mackie says. The problem of evil, in the sense in which I shall be using the phrase, is a problem only for someone who believes that there is a God who is both omnipotent and wholly good. And it is a logical problem, the problem of reconciling and clarifying a number of beliefs. He says this, in the simplest form, the problem is this. God is omnipotent. God is wholly good. Yet evil exists. There seems to be some contradiction between these three propositions, so that if any two of them were true, the third would be false. So, for example, just breaking from the reading here for a second, if God is omnipotent and God is wholly good, then it would be false that there's evil. But at the same time, all three are essential parts of the theological positions, so says Mackie. The theologian, it seems, must at once adhere and cannot consistently adhere to all three. So we're going to reconstruct Mackie's argument for the claim that if God exists, then there's no evil. His argument for the claim that God's existence is incompatible with the existence of evil. And that argument will draw on, as Mackie points out, claims that are part of classical theism itself. And part of what's powerful about this is he thinks the classical theist can't reject any of these premises without ceasing to be a classical theist. Classical theism we're going to understand as the conjunction of four claims. First, God exists. And the following three claims are true. So classical theism is the claim that there's a God and then a series of claims that characterize what God is like. And those are going to be the ones that are important for Mackie and for us as we reconstruct this argument. We're going to call them O1 through O3. O1 says, if God exists, then God is omnibenevolent. O2 says, if God exists, then God is omnipotent. And O3 says, if God exists, then God is omniscient. These three together characterize some of the core essential properties of the God of classical theism: omnibenevolence, omnipotence, and omniscience. Omnibenevolence, as a reminder, we talked about these definitions in class, is perfect goodness. Omnipotence is the ability to do anything, and then omniscience is knowledge of every truth. So what these three say is that if God exists, then God's perfectly good. If God exists, then God can do anything. And if God exists, then God knows every truth. I'm just putting in blue here the three O propositions. because Mackey is going to use O1 through O3 as premises in his argument for the claim that if God exists, then there's no evil. I'm slotting them in to show that these three are supposed to logically lead to, or validly lead to, the conclusion that if God exists, then there's no evil. And notice that I'm dropping out the omniscience bit. Following Mackey, we're going to try to derive the conclusion that if God exists, there's no evil, only by relying on claims about omnibenevolence and omnipotence. Mackey notes that if we just had those three propositions that are definitional of classical theism that define what God would be like if God existed, we wouldn't quite be able to validly reach that first premise of the abbreviated argument from evil. He says this: the contradiction that is between God and evil does not immediately arise. He says to show it, we need some additional principles, or perhaps some quasi-logical rules connecting the terms good, evil, and omnipotent. So if all we had were the claim that if God exists, then God is perfectly good, and if God exists, then God is all-powerful, it doesn't quite follow from those two alone that if God exists, then there's no evil. I mean, those first two claims don't even mention evil. All they say is that if God exists, then God is good, and if God exists, then God's all-powerful. Well, what would a good being do with respect to evil that it could get rid of, and which evils could all-powerful being eliminate or get rid of? And those additional claims, while Mackey thinks they're really plausible, have to be slotted into the argument as well. They're bridging the gap between the notion of goodness and the existence of evil, and the notion of omnipotence and the existence of evil. Here's how he puts these bridge principles. These additional principles are that good is opposed to evil in such a way that a good thing always eliminates evil as far as it can. It's their first one. And that there are no limits to what an omnipotent thing can do. From these, it follows that a good omnipotent thing eliminates every evil completely. And then the propositions that a good omnipotent thing exists and that evil exists are incompatible. So once we add in these bridge principles, which I'm going to put in green, we'll have the makings of a valid argument for the conclusion that if God exists, then there's no evil, which was the first step in the shortened argument from evil. So here we're going to call them B1 through B3 because they're bridge principles. And Mackey thinks of these as just obviously definitionally true. He thinks he doesn't really need to defend these in much detail. First, a perfectly good being eliminates every evil that it can. And remember that by eliminate, we might also mean either eliminate if it's an existing evil or prevent from occurring in the first place. So B1 could be understood to say a perfectly good being either eliminates or prevents every evil that it can eliminate or prevent. This, according to Mackey, is just like part of what it means to be good. Like if you're morally good, if you're compassionate and you see some suffering and you can get rid of it, you pass by a child who is crying out for help and you know you can help them, then if you're good, you'll help. If you can eliminate the pain, you will. If you can alleviate it, you'll do that. You'll do what you can to make the evil or the pain and suffering lessen and go away. An omnipotent being can eliminate every evil. This tells us about the scope of omnipotence. What can an omnipotent being do? Well, it can do anything. So among the things it should be able to do is get rid of or prevent every single instance of pain and suffering. And then finally, an omniscient being, which knows everything, therefore knows about every evil that there is, past, present, and future. These are the three bridge principles. They tell us what how to link together the notion of perfect goodness, omnipotence, and omniscience on the one hand, and evil on the other. Let's take B1 and B2 and slot them in here and combine them with our existing premises, which are the first two propositions that make up classical theism. So what we have so far is O1 and O2, and B1 and B2. O1 says that if God exists, then God is omnibenevolent. O2 says that if God exists, then God is omnipotent. B1 says a perfectly good or omnibenevolent being eliminates every evil it can, and B2 says that an omnipotent being can eliminate every evil. And from these, it does logically follow that therefore, if God exists, then there's no evil. To see this, though, we will have to make a few more inferences, but we don't have to add any additional assumptions. Mackey thinks one of the virtues of this argument is that it uses only bridge principles that are, he thinks, definitionally true, like B1 or B2, and the other assumptions are part of classical theism. So the only thing a classical theist could plausibly do is give up on their theism, which is the goal of the argument anyway. In class, what we did was we renamed these steps to indicate that they're all part of a single argument. And the first step is going to be the first bridge principle, citing B1 as justification over there just to indicate that's where it's coming from. We now have AE1, or argument from evil one. A perfectly good being eliminates every evil it can. That's our first premise. Our second premise is just O1. If God exists, then God is omnibenevolent or perfectly good. That's just the definition. Where does that come from? That comes from the first proposition that makes up classical theism. It's the characteristic of the classical theistic God. It follows from AE1 and AE2. Therefore, if God exists, then God eliminates every evil God can, citing as justification off to the side there AE1 and AE2. Why? Well, because if God exists, then God is perfectly good, and a perfectly good being eliminates every evil it can. So, therefore, if God exists, then God eliminates every evil God can. Now, notice that AE3 doesn't tell us which evils God can eliminate. So this is why we need to add in additional claims about omnipotence, because omnipotence tells us about power or ability. AE4 says an omnipotent being can eliminate every evil. This is the second bridge principle. And AE5, which is the second proposition that makes up classical theism, tells us that if God exists, then God is omnipotent. AE4 and AE5 together entail that therefore, if God exists, then God can eliminate every evil. And we now have our answer to the question of which evils can God eliminate. Which ones? Well, if there is a God, then God can eliminate every evil. Why? Because if God exists, God is omnipotent, and an omnipotent being can eliminate every evil by definition. So AE6 follows from 4 and 5. Now, if we look back up to what we've concluded so far, if we look at 3, we have if God exists, then God eliminates every evil God can. And we just asked ourselves, which evils can God eliminate? And the answer that we got, using resources internal to theism itself, was if God exists, then God can eliminate every evil, from which it follows that if God exists, God eliminates every evil. Because 3 says if God exists, then God eliminates every evil God can. And then 6 tells us God can eliminate every single evil. So if God exists, God does eliminate every evil. That follows from 3 and 6, and we've cited that as justification. Now, of course, if God eliminates every evil, then there is no evil. So from AE7, it follows that therefore, if God exists, then there is no evil. And recall that was just the first step of the shortened argument from evil. So we now have completed our argument from claims that are supposed to be either true by definition or drawing from just classical theism itself to the conclusion that God's existence is somehow incompatible with the existence of evil. All we need to do to add to that conditional claim at 8 to get a valid argument against the existence of God is add, of course, there is evil at AE9, from which it follows from 8 and 9, therefore God does not exist. Because at 8 we have, if God exists, then there's no evil, but there is evil, therefore God does not exist. This is the classic statement, and in Mackey we get a very rigorous logical formulation of the argument for the conclusion that God's existence is logically incompatible with evil. And of course, because we know that there is evil, we have to reject, according to Mackey, the existence of the God of classical theism. This was where on your handout, if you're following along on your handouts, this is what you had, these blanks, and we've just filled these in, including the justification columns. Keep in mind that if you're a theist or if you're somebody who's suspicious of this argument and you reject the conclusion because you think that God does exist, or because perhaps you think that this is not a sound argument, either way, whether you reject the conclusion or you're just suspicious of the argument, it had better be because you reject one or more of the premises. Because what we did was we validly inferred that conclusion at AE10 from earlier steps. And it sure seems like AE9 is not up for debate. No one should deny that there's evil in the sense of pain and suffering. Of course there is. And AE8 followed from AE7. So if you reject 8, it had better be because you reject 7. But then 7 likewise followed from 3 and 6, and it followed validly. So if you reject 7, you must either reject 3 or 6 or both. But then when we check those ones followed validly from earlier steps. 6 followed from 4 and 5, and 3 followed from 1 and 2. So if you reject either 3 or 6, it had better be because you also reject 1, 2, 4, 5, or all of them, or some combination thereof. But when we look at 4 and 5, it seems really hard for a theist to deny either of those two. I mean, an omnipotent being can eliminate every evil seems to just follow from the definition of God as a being, or just from the definition of an omnipotent being as a being that can do anything. And then 5 is just part of classical theism. If you're like, well, I reject 5, then what you're saying is if God exists, then God is not omnipotent. Mackey, as we mentioned in class, is willing to hear you out on that. And in a way, he'll pocket that as a victory. I mean, he then has gotten you to conclude that I guess the God of classical theism doesn't exist, because the God of classical theism, by definition, is omnipotent. So if he can convince you to reject 5, he thinks effectively he's argued you into rejecting classical theism, which was his goal anyway. That leaves us with 1 and 2, and 2 is, just like 5, not something that any classical theist can give up without ceasing to be a classical theist. When we turned to 1, what we saw was initially it looked really plausible, but it is susceptible to some pretty straightforward counterexamples. 1 tells us that a perfectly good being would eliminate any evil that it could. And what we need for a counterexample to this premise would just be an example of a hypothetical perfectly good being. It doesn't have to be God, because this is supposed to be true by definition. A perfectly good being that can get rid of some evil, that knows about it, but that doesn't, and is nevertheless still good. In other words, a being that has a justifiable reason for failing to eliminate some evil that it can eliminate. We talked about some possible counterexamples in class. You might think a parent who knows that their child is experiencing some suffering, who can get rid of it, but who declines to get rid of the suffering because they think, rightly or wrongly, that it's in the child's best interest at the end of the day to endure the suffering, perhaps in order to gain some character trait or to learn some lesson that they couldn't learn if the parent eliminated the evil. Those are going to be interesting, but perhaps less clear-cut counterexamples, partly because there's lots of disagreement over what good parenting is and when parents should and shouldn't intervene. We had a silly example that I gave in class, the perfectly good doctor. The perfectly good doctor knows about the paper cut that you have, acknowledges that it's a good, and is very capable of eliminating it entirely from the world right now. But if the perfectly good doctor is really perfectly good, they won't eliminate the paper cut, because the only way they could do that would be to surgically remove your finger. I mean, they can give you a Band-Aid and let it heal on its own, but they do have the power to completely get rid of the paper cut from your finger, but the power that they have requires them to introduce a further evil, namely you're not having a finger anymore. Or another way to look at it is removing a good that in the end is better or outweighing relative to the evil of having a paper cut. So what this means, this example of the perfectly good doctor, it doesn't mean that the argument from evil is just done for and there's nothing that the atheist can do and there's nothing Mackey can say. Instead, often what happens in philosophy is that an interesting argument will rely on a general principle that turns out to be susceptible to a counterexample, and the thing to ask yourself is, can that original principle be nuanced or revised in a way to take into account that kind of case? And what we said is, yes, it is certainly possible to revise AE1 to take into account perfectly good doctor type cases. What we arrived at was the conclusion that a perfectly good being doesn't necessarily eliminate every evil that it can. Instead, it eliminates only a subset of the evils that it can eliminate. Which ones? Well, a perfectly good being will definitely eliminate any evil that it can eliminate without either causing more evil or eliminating an equal or greater good. So if a being is good and it knows that there's some suffering out there and it can get rid of it without, so to speak, doing further damage to the world, those evils the perfectly good being will definitely eliminate. But there may be other evils that the perfectly good being could get rid of, but knows that it couldn't get rid of without doing more damage to the world. Those evils, if a being is really good, it's going to leave alone. It's going to say, my goodness, in fact, obligates me to not touch those because I don't want to make things worse. So that's where we left off with the first version of the argument from evil. And the second version picks up there. And what we have to do is revise the argument in order to accommodate this change we've made in the first premise. And so there will be another review video on that second version.